Christy Wesselman was 15 years old in the summer of 1985. She lived with her family in Glen Ellen, Illinois, a quiet, middle-class suburb west of Chicago. The neighborhood was considered safe, with tree-lined streets and small parks scattered between modest family homes. It was the kind of place where children played outside until sunset and parents rarely feared for their safety. Christy was a well-liked, outgoing teenager with a bright future ahead. That summer, she was attending summer school and spent most of her free time with friends or at home with her mother.
On a warm afternoon, Christy left her house to walk to a nearby convenience store. She planned to buy a soda and a chocolate bar for herself and her mother. The store was less than a 10-minute walk away, and she was expected to return shortly. Her mother stayed behind, assuming it was a routine errand. But as the minutes turned into hours and Christy still hadn't come back, a creeping sense of unease began to set in. At first, her mother thought Christy might have gotten distracted or met up with friends along the way. She made phone calls to people Christy knew, hoping someone had seen her. None had. As night approached and there was still no word, her concern deepened. She went out herself, retracing the likely path Christy would have taken. She stopped by the store, looked around the neighborhood, and checked nearby streets. But there was no sign of her daughter. By the next morning, Christy's mother contacted the police. Investigators began interviewing locals and piecing together Christy's last known movements. A clerk at the store confirmed that she had arrived around 4 p.m. and left soon after. Other witnesses corroborated this timeline. Police expanded their search and turned their attention to a nearby vacant lot, often used as a shortcut. The path cut through tall grass, leading toward a more secluded area. It was a route familiar to neighborhood children, and it soon became the focal point of the unfolding investigation. As the search for Christy Wesselman intensified, investigators turned their attention to a vacant lot near the path Christy likely took to and from the store. This shortcut, bordered by tall grass and scattered trees, was well known to local children. It connected a residential street with a nearby convenience store and a McDonald's, making it a common route for kids in the neighborhood. On the second day of the search, detectives methodically combed through the lot, scanning for any sign of the missing teenager. During the sweep, one detective noticed something out of place in the grass. Moving in for a closer look, he found what no one wanted to find: Christy's body, partially concealed by thin overgrowth. The area was immediately cordoned off, and crime scene technicians were called to process the scene. Despite careful examination, investigators found no footprints, no discarded items, and no visible signs of a struggle in the immediate area. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Christy had been sexually assaulted and stabbed 8 times. Biological evidence was collected from the body and preserved, though at the time DNA testing was still a developing technology. Her clothing was carefully catalogued, and investigators noted a troubling detail. The pearl ring Christy had been wearing was missing. This led detectives to consider the possibility that the killer had taken it as a trophy. What puzzled investigators even more was the location itself. Just beyond the lot stood a gas station, and nearby, a family had been hosting a backyard barbecue at the same time Christy had disappeared. Yet no one heard anything unusual. No scream, no struggle, no movement through the brush. This silence led detectives to theorize that Christy may have known her attacker or had been approached in a way that caused no alarm. Following the discovery of Christy Wesselman's body, detectives launched an intensive investigation. The crime scene's proximity to homes, a busy gas station, and a backyard barbecue suggested that someone might have seen or heard something. Yet, despite these surroundings, no witnesses came forward with relevant information. No one reported screams, strange vehicles, or unusual activity that afternoon. The apparent silence only deepened the mystery and forced investigators to consider the unsettling possibility that the crime occurred swiftly and without resistance. In the days that followed, detectives turned their attention to those closest to Christie. Family members, classmates, and neighbors were interviewed thoroughly. The goal was to uncover any pattern, connection, or person who might have posed a threat. Investigators also began examining local men with criminal records, particularly those with histories involving violence or sexual offenses. Several individuals were questioned, and a few were brought in for more in-depth interrogation. However, none of these interviews produced viable leads or arrests. The missing pearl ring remained a point of interest. Christie's mother had described it in detail, and police distributed its description to local pawn shops. They hoped that if the ring resurfaced, it might provide a lead. But despite ongoing monitoring, the ring never appeared in any store or report. This absence, combined with the lack of physical evidence and eyewitness accounts, stalled the investigation. Forensic science at the time was limited in scope. Although biological samples had been collected from Christie's body, DNA testing was still an emerging technology and could not provide the clarity it might today. The evidence was stored, with hopes for future analysis. Meanwhile, police followed every tip submitted by the public. Some came from people convinced they'd seen something. Others named individuals they suspected. Yet, each lead dissolved under scrutiny, failing to produce actionable information. Detectives began to consider that the killer may have known Christie, or was familiar enough with the area to strike undetected. If the crime had occurred swiftly, possibly within seconds, that might explain the absence of noise and struggle. Still, the inability to identify a suspect or even a plausible motive added to the growing frustration. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. As time passed, leads grew colder. The case remained active, but progress was limited. Without modern forensic tools, investigators had little more than intuition, interviews, and community tips to rely on. Despite cooperation from residents and the dedication of law enforcement, no solid break occurred during those early years. The investigation, though persistent, had stalled, leaving Christie's case unresolved and her family without answers. By 1988, forensic science had begun evolving. DNA profiling, though still in its early stages, was becoming a viable tool for criminal investigations. Detectives revisited Christy Wesselman's case, hoping this new technology might uncover answers that previous methods could not. They began collecting DNA samples from individuals who had been considered suspects during the original investigation. Most complied without resistance, submitting samples voluntarily in the hope of eliminating themselves from suspicion. One exception stood out: Dana Henry. At the time of Christie's murder, Henry had lived near the scene and had been an early person of interest. Unlike the others, he refused to provide a DNA sample. His reluctance immediately raised concerns among investigators who viewed his refusal as potentially incriminating. With no legal obligation to comply voluntarily, police sought a court order to compel the sample. Henry's refusal led to a contempt of court charge, and he was held in jail for several days. Ultimately, he agreed to provide the DNA sample. When the results came back, they confirmed that Henry was not a match. He was cleared scientifically and officially removed from suspicion. However, the consequences of the ordeal lingered long after his release. The experience left Henry's life in disarray. The stigma of being publicly associated with a child's murder investigation proved damaging. The legal expenses and the emotional toll affected his personal relationships and financial stability. His reputation suffered, and the community's perception of him never fully recovered. In the years that followed, he filed a lawsuit against the police department, alleging harm caused by their actions. The case, however, was dismissed. Although Henry was exonerated, the incident marked the first visible instance of collateral damage stemming from the unsolved nature of Christie's case. While DNA technology helped eliminate a suspect, it also revealed how even scientific clarity could arrive too late to prevent real, lasting consequences. In 1989, 4 years after Christy Wesselman's murder, the investigation veered into unexpected territory. A local man named Willis, who had been persistently contacting Christie's family, became a figure of concern. He offered unsolicited tips about the case and repeatedly inserted himself into conversations surrounding the investigation. His behavior unsettled the family, and eventually they sought legal protection. A restraining order was granted against Willis, formally limiting his contact. While his conduct appeared suspicious to some, law enforcement thoroughly investigated and found no evidence connecting him to the crime. He remained outside the scope of suspicion, and the case once again returned to a standstill. In 2000, investigators took a long-anticipated step forward. The biological evidence collected in 1985, carefully preserved through the years, was uploaded into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. This national database had become a critical tool in solving cold cases by matching unknown DNA profiles to known offenders. The decision to submit Christie's evidence reflected renewed hope that technological advancements might finally bring resolution. Detectives awaited results, knowing that even a partial match could break the case open. But no match came. The DNA sample did not correspond to any profiles in the system. Despite the growing power of forensic databases, Christie's case remained unresolved. The years that followed were marked by silence. Though investigators occasionally revisited the file and public interest surfaced periodically, no meaningful progress was made. Leads remained sparse, and tips that did surface led nowhere. These years underscored the emotional toll on Christie's family and the investigative frustration that came with each dead end. Even as science advanced, the case lingered in limbo. The restraining order against Willis and the fruitless DNA upload stood as reminders, tangible steps that, despite their promise, brought no answers. The investigation entered its quietest phase, defined by waiting. In 2015, 3 decades after the murder of Christy Wesselman, the case finally shifted. A match emerged in the FBI's combined DNA index system. The biological evidence collected from Christie's body in 1985 was linked to Michael Jones, a 62-year-old man arrested for domestic violence. Until this point, Jones had never been mentioned in the original investigation and had not appeared on any suspect lists. A detailed background check uncovered an extensive history of violent offenses. In the mid-70s, Jones was convicted of assault and sentenced to prison. He was released in the early 1980s. In 1983, just 2 years prior to Christie's death, he violently attacked a woman, leaving her hospitalized. Despite the severity of that incident, he was granted early release once again. He married after his release, but the marriage deteriorated. In 1994, his wife secured a restraining order against him, citing increasingly disturbing behavior toward a young female relative. 5 years later, in 1999, Jones was arrested once more, this time for assaulting a family member. Each charge added to a clear pattern of violence spanning decades. Despite this, he had managed to stay largely beneath the radar, with no direct connection to Glen Ellyn or the Wesselman family. Investigators also discovered that Jones frequently traveled alone on a motorcycle. He had made multiple trips through the Midwest, including into the Chicago suburbs. This revelation led detectives to theorize that Jones may have been passing through Glen Ellyn when Christie was attacked. It offered a potential explanation for why he had eluded scrutiny for so long. He simply hadn't been from the area. This forensic breakthrough marked a pivotal moment. After 30 years of silence and speculation, Christie's killer had finally been identified, not through a confession or a tip, but by the undeniable match of DNA. In 2015, when detectives contacted Christy Wesselman's mother, she expected another update with no real progress. For decades, each call had followed the same rhythm, hopeful but inconclusive. This time was different. The voice on the line informed her that they had identified Christie's killer. DNA collected from Christie's body in 1985 had been matched to Michael Jones, the man arrested earlier that year in a separate case. After 30 years of uncertainty, the forensic evidence had finally delivered a name. For Christie's family, the news offered long-awaited resolution, but it was far from simple. Relief was tempered by grief, by the reality of what had been lost, and the time that could never be regained. Christie's mother recalled the day of the murder with stark clarity, and now, after so many years, she was hearing the name of the man responsible for the first time. It was not someone she knew or had ever suspected. Jones had never crossed their path until his name surfaced through the DNA database. The fact that Jones had evaded capture for so long added another layer to the family's emotions. His record, marked by violent acts and legal encounters, revealed a man who had slipped repeatedly through gaps in the system. The tools that ultimately led to his identification, DNA indexing, and national databases, did not exist in 1985. Justice had arrived not through confession or witness, but through science that had caught up to a crime committed before it was fully capable of solving it. In the end, Christie's family had the answer they had waited decades for. It did not undo the loss, but it brought truth. The The resolution was not triumphant, only honest, an ending shaped by time, perseverance, and the unrelenting pursuit of clarity.